They assumed I was falling behind. I let them. Section 1. The weekend plans that stopped. Including me. The silence of a phone that used to buzz every Friday at 4:30 p.m. is a specific kind of weight. It isn't loud, it isn't aggressive, it's just absent. I sat in my home office in the suburbs of North Carolina, watching the dust motes dance in a stray beam of afternoon light. My screen was dark. For 15 years, this was the hour when the group chat would ignite. Brian would suggest a brewery. Jason would argue for the new steakhouse. The wives, Sophie, Rachel, Emily, would coordinate arrival times and babysitters. It was a machine, a social engine that ran on predictability and shared history. But today, the screen stayed black. No notifications, no banners, just the reflection of my own face in the glass. I realized then that I was being phased out. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a dramatic falling out. It was a tactical retreat. I stayed silent because I wanted to see how long it would take for someone to notice I wasn't there. I had sold my tech consulting firm 6 months prior. To the outside world, I was between projects. To my friends, I was struggling. I had intentionally simplified my life. I drove an older SUV now. I stopped wearing the luxury watches Brian and Jason obsessed over. I started spending my mornings in the garden or reading in the local library. In a circle defined by upward mobility, my stillness looked like a crash. I watched Sophie walk past the office door. She looked at me, then at my phone on the desk. She knew. We had discussed the shift in tone months ago. She was the one who first pointed out how Rachel's voice changed when she asked about our budget. It was a soft, condescending pity. It was the kind of tone you use for someone who has lost their way. Sophie didn't mind the distance. She preferred the peace. But I was curious. I wanted to observe the mechanics of social displacement. I wanted to see the exact moment when a person's value in a group becomes tied to their perceived utility or status. The first missed invite happened 3 weeks ago. A lake house trip. I saw the photos on social media afterward. Brian was holding a craft beer, laughing at something Jason said. They looked successful. They looked like they were winning. The caption read, "The core crew." I wasn't in the core anymore. I had become a peripheral figure, a cautionary tale. I could imagine the conversations they had over the charcoal grill. Poor Aaron. He just couldn't scale the business. I think the market moved too fast for him. He seems tired. They didn't call to ask. They didn't check in to see if I was okay. They simply adjusted the perimeter of the circle. I stayed silent because the narrative they were building was more interesting than the truth. If I told them the sale of my firm had secured my family's future for 3 generations, the dynamic would shift back to a fake, hollow equilibrium. But by letting them believe I was failing, I saw their true faces. I saw Brian's subtle smirk when he mentioned his new promotion. I saw Jason's performative concern when he offered to look over my resume. They weren't my friends. They were my competitors in a game I had stopped playing. The realization was cold, but it was also liberating. There is a strange power in being underestimated. It grants you a level of invisibility that is impossible to achieve when you are at the top. I walked downstairs and joined Sophie in the kitchen. She was making tea. The house was quiet. No more frantic texts. No more social obligations that felt like chores. I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known in a decade. But I also felt a sharp, growing curiosity. How far would they go to confirm their own superiority? How much of their identity was built on the idea that I was beneath them? I went to the grocery store later that evening. I saw Rachel in the produce aisle. She saw me, too. Her eyes widened for a split second, a flicker of discomfort before she masked it with a bright, tight smile. She didn't come over. She turned her cart toward the bakery. She avoided the interaction entirely. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. I was no longer an asset to her social standing. I was a reminder of potential failure. I was a reminder of potential failure. I was the ghost at the feast. That night, I sat on the back porch and watched the stars. The world felt larger now that the group was gone. The social pressure that had dictated my clothes, my car, and my vocabulary was evaporating. I realized that my silence wasn't just a choice, it was a mirror. It reflected back to them whatever they needed to believe to feel secure in their own lives. If they needed me to be the fallen friend, to feel like rising stars, I would let them. I would play the part perfectly. I would wait. The first section of our lives was over. The foundation was shifting. I could feel the tension rising in the distance, even if they couldn't. They were moving forward based on an assumption that was fundamentally flawed. I wondered what would happen when the weight of their own expectations began to crush them. I wondered if they would ever realize that the person they were pitying was the only one who was truly free. As I turned off the porch light, I saw a text finally come through. It was from Jason. "Hey man, thinking of you. Hope things turn around soon. Let us know if you need anything." It wasn't an invite. It was a closing of the door. I didn't reply. I went to bed, wondering how long it would be before Jason realized he was the one who was trapped. Section 2. Questions that weren't really questions. The invitations didn't stop entirely. They changed. They became mercy invites. Small, low-stakes gatherings where the power imbalance could be reinforced in person. Brian invited me for coffee at a local spot. Not our usual high-end haunt, but a generic chain. He dressed in his full corporate regalia, the tailored suit, the expensive leather briefcase, the polished shoes. I showed up in a plain gray sweatshirt and jeans. I could see him cataloging my appearance. He was checking for signs of decay. He was looking for the cracks in my armor. "So, Aaron," he started, leaning back and crossing his legs, "how's the search going? I know the market is tough for guys our age. Experience is great, but these startups want energy, you know?" He emphasized the word energy as if it were a secret code I no longer possessed. It wasn't a question about my well-being. It was a statement about my obsolescence. He wanted me to admit I was struggling. He wanted the satisfaction of offering advice from the summit of his own perceived success. I stayed silent for a moment, stirred my coffee, and looked him in the eye. "It's been an interesting time, Brian. Very quiet." I didn't elaborate. I didn't mention the 3 board seats I had been offered or the private equity firm that was currently vetting my next investment strategy. I let the word quiet hang in the air. To a man like Brian, quiet is a synonym for dead. He nodded slowly, a look of profound manufactured sympathy crossing his face. "I get it. Sometimes you just have to take a step back and reassess. If you need me to make some calls to my recruiters, just say the word. No shame in it. We've all been there." He was enjoying this. He was the benefactor now. For years, I had been the one with the higher revenue, the faster growth, the more stable home. Now, in his mind, the roles had flipped. He wasn't helping a friend. He was marking his territory. He was confirming that he had survived the race, and I had stumbled. I thanked him politely. I didn't decline, and I didn't accept. I simply let his offer sit there like a discarded napkin. The conversation turned to his latest project, a massive merger that he claimed was all on his shoulders. I listened. I watched his body language. He was leaning forward, speaking louder than necessary, eyes darting around to see if anyone else in the coffee shop was noticing his importance. He was performing. He was desperate for the validation that I was no longer qualified to give him. I realized then that Brian didn't value my friendship. He valued my role as a benchmark. Without me to compete against, his own achievements felt less substantial. He needed me to be the floor so he could feel like the ceiling. I stayed silent because I realized that my lack of struggle was actually more threatening to him than the struggle itself. If I wasn't falling apart, then his entire narrative of the tough market and the grind was just a story he told himself to justify his own stress. A week later, we were invited to Jason and Emily's house for a casual dinner. This was the true test. The whole group would be there. I told Sophie to dress simply. No jewelry, no designer labels. We arrived in the old SUV. As we pulled into the driveway, parked between Jason's new German sports car and Brian's luxury electric vehicle, the contrast was deliberate. We looked like the poor relations coming for a handout. I could see Jason watching from the window. The evening was a master class in passive-aggressive social positioning. Rachel spent the entire appetizer round talking about their upcoming vacation to the Maldives. She kept turning to Sophie, saying, "Oh, you guys should go sometime when things settle down. It's so restorative." Sophie just smiled and nodded. "It sounds lovely, Rachel." She didn't mention that we had spent a month in a private villa in Tuscany over the summer, away from social media, away from them. The questions weren't really questions. "Are you still keeping the house? Or are you looking to downsize?" Jason asked while carving the roast. "Is Sophie going back to work full-time?" Emily added, her voice dripping with feigned concern. They were probing for the extent of our ruin. They wanted to know exactly how much we had lost. I realized that they weren't just curious. They were relieved. My decline made their own frantic, debt-fueled lives feel more secure. I stayed silent because I was fascinated by the architecture of their assumptions. They had built an entire world where I was the victim. Every time I didn't defend myself, every time I didn't flash my bank balance or talk about my assets, I was feeding that world. It was a psychological experiment. I was watching them build a cage for me, not realizing that I was the one holding the key. I was the observer, and they were the subjects. The tension in the room was palpable, but it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from them. They were working so hard to maintain the illusion of their superiority that they were becoming exhausted. Brian was drinking more than usual. Jason was snapping at Emily over small things. They were winning, but they didn't look happy. They looked like they were running a race that had no finish line. As we left that night, Jason walked me to the car. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Seriously, Aaron, don't be too proud to ask for help. We're your friends." He said the word friends like it was a charity. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the deep-seated insecurity in his eyes. He needed me to be failing. He needed it for his own sanity. "I appreciate that, Jason," I said quietly. "I'll keep it in mind." I drove away, feeling the weight of their expectations fading in the rearview mirror. They thought they knew my story. They thought they had written the final chapter. But they were reading a book I had already closed. The silence between us was growing, and in that silence, I was finding a new kind of power. I was no longer part of their hierarchy. I was something else entirely, something they couldn't categorize, something they couldn't control. The question wasn't what would happen to me. The question was what would happen to them when they realized the story they were telling was a lie. Section 3. I noticed who needed the story to be true. The human mind is a strange architect. It builds structures out of air just to feel safe. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see that my fall wasn't just a piece of gossip for our circle. It was a necessary pillar of their own self-worth. I started watching them more closely during the rare group interactions that remained. I noticed how Brian's posture improved only when he was standing next to me. I noticed how Rachel's complaints about her overwhelming social calendar were always directed at Sophie, as if reminding us of a life we no longer deserve to lead. I stayed silent because I realized that correcting them would actually be an act of cruelty. If I revealed that I was wealthier, more relaxed, and more secure than I had ever been, I would dismantle the only thing making their current stress bearable. They were all drowning in high-interest mortgages and the desperate need to maintain appearances in an increasingly volatile economy. My supposed failure was their safety net. It was the proof that their hustle was working, because look at Aaron. He stopped, and look what happened to him. The social dynamics shifted into a state of performative pity. We were invited to a backyard barbecue at the Keller's house in late July. The heat in Charlotte was oppressive, but the social atmosphere was colder. I saw Mark Ellison, the quiet observer of the group, standing by the drinks cooler. Mark was a decent man, an architect who spoke little but saw much. He was the only one who didn't look at me with that tilted head expression of practiced sympathy. He just nodded. "How's the garden, Aaron?" Mark asked. He didn't ask about my job search or my bank account. He asked about the thing I was actually doing. "It's thriving, Mark," I replied. "The soil took some work, but once you get the foundation right, things just grow." Brian overheard this and let out a short, sharp laugh as he approached with a tray of expensive Wagyu sliders. "I wish I had time for gardening. Some of us are still in the trenches, right? I was up until 2,000 a.m. on the Sterling account, but hey, that's the price of being at the top of the food chain." He patted his stomach, looking at me for a reaction. He wanted me to look envious. He wanted me to sigh and mention how much I missed the action. I just smiled. "The price seems high, Brian. I hope it's worth it." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second. It was a glitch in his programming. He didn't know how to process a man who wasn't mourning his lost status. He turned away to boast to Jason about his new membership at the country club, the same club I had quietly resigned from a year ago, because I found the company tedious. He mentioned the entrance fee loudly enough for the whole patio to hear. It was a declaration of war against an enemy that wasn't fighting back. I realized then that Brian needed the story to be true because he was terrified. He was terrified that he was one bad quarter away from being me. By convincing himself that I had lost it, he could convince himself that he was keeping it. He was using my silence to build a wall between himself and his own professional anxiety. I watched him drink his third beer, his eyes scanning the yard for more validation. He was a man running a marathon on a treadmill, wondering why the scenery never changed. Sophie was trapped in a corner with Rachel and Emily. They were showing her photos of designer handbags. I saw Sophie nod, her expression neutral and polite. She was playing the role perfectly. She didn't mention the private art collection we had started, or the fact that her quiet schedule was due to her volunteer work at a high-end, non-profit board. She let them believe her life had shrunk to the size of a suburban kitchen. I stayed silent because I was waiting for the moment the narrative would start to leak. A lie that big requires constant maintenance. You have to keep checking to see if the person you're pitying is still below you. But what happens when that person doesn't act like a victim? What happens when the broken man is the only one in the room whose hands aren't shaking? As we left, Mark caught my eye again. He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knew. He was the only one who had actually looked at the car I was driving, not the age of it, but the condition. He noticed the lack of stress in my eyes. He noticed that I didn't need the Wagyu sliders to feel important. But even Mark stayed silent. In a group governed by a shared lie, the truth is a social hand grenade. I drove home in the cooling evening air, the windows down. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for my friends' arrogance. Their belief in my decline was a gift. It had cleared the table of all the fake obligations and superficial ties. I was seeing the world with a clarity that only comes when you are no longer invited to the table. The story they needed was keeping them occupied while I was building something they couldn't even imagine. Section 4. Silence changes the shape of a lie. There is a point where a rumor stops being a topic of conversation and starts being an accepted fact of nature. By the autumn, my struggle was no longer news. It was the baseline. I was the guy who didn't make it. I was the cautionary tale whispered to new associates at their firms. Don't pull an Aaron Mitchell. Keep your foot on the gas. I stayed silent because I was curious about the shape of the lie. When you don't provide information, people fill the vacuum with their own greatest fears. Brian assumed I was broke because he feared being broke. Jason assumed I was depressed because he feared losing his social standing. They weren't talking about me anymore. They were talking about their own nightmares. The dynamic changed when Jason's company hit a restructuring phase. I heard about it through the grapevine, not from the group chat. Suddenly, the invites to the expensive dinners stopped for everyone, not just me. The group became fractured. The core crew was suddenly very busy with family obligations. I decided to host a small gathering at our house. It was a test of the social gravity. I invited everyone for a simple Sunday lunch, sandwiches, and tea. No catering, no showing off. I wanted to see how they behaved when the theater of their success was under threat. When they arrived, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Jason looked pale. His expensive watch was gone, replaced by a bare wrist. He talked incessantly about pivoting and consulting opportunities. He was using the same language they had used for me 6 months ago. The irony was thick enough to choke on. I watched Rachel try to maintain the facade. She talked about the benefits of a simpler life, her eyes darting around our living room. She was looking for signs of our poverty to make herself feel better about her own tightening budget. She saw the slightly worn rug. She saw the lack of new electronics. She didn't see the original oil painting in the hallway or the high-end security system. She only saw what she wanted to see, a reflection of her own growing fear. "It must be nice, Aaron," Jason said, picking at a sandwich, "to have so little to worry about. I mean, after the business went under, it must be a relief to just be done." I stayed silent for a beat too long. I let the word echo in the room. My business hadn't gone under. It had been acquired for a staggering sum. But I hadn't corrected the under-narrative when it started, and now it was a solid wall in Jason's mind. "Peace has its own value, Jason," I said softly. "I don't miss the pressure of having to prove I'm winning every single day. It's exhausting, isn't it?" Jason's face flinched. It was a direct hit, but delivered with such a calm tone that he couldn't take offense. He looked at Brian, seeking backup. But Brian was staring at his feet. Brian's own firm was facing a series of lawsuits he hadn't told anyone about. The hierarchy was crumbling, and because they had built their entire friendship on the foundation of being better than me, they had nowhere to turn now that they were falling. I stayed silent because I realized that the lie had changed shape. It was no longer a weapon they used against me. It was a weight they were carrying. They had to keep pretending I was the one who failed, even as their own lives were hitting the rocks. If they admitted I was fine, they would have to admit that their own success was a fragile, hollow shell. Throughout the afternoon, I watched them struggle to maintain the old roles. They tried to pity me, but it came out as bitterness. They tried to boast, but it sounded like pleading. They were looking for the Aaron they had created, the broken, defeated man, because that man was the only one who could make them feel safe. But I wouldn't give him to them. I remained calm, centered, and entirely unbothered. I noticed Emily looking at Sophie. Sophie was talking about a book she had read. She looked younger, rested, and genuinely happy. Emily, on the other hand, looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. The story of our decline was being contradicted by the physical reality of our peace. You can lie with words, but you can't lie with the way your skin looks or the way your voice doesn't shake when you speak. As the lunch ended, the exit was rushed. They couldn't wait to leave. Our house, which was supposed to be a place of mercy, had become a place of judgment. Not because I judged them, I hadn't said a single negative word, but because my silence forced them to judge themselves. I stood in the doorway as their cars pulled away. They didn't honk, they didn't wave, they drove in silence. I turned back to the house. Sophie was clearing the table. "They know, don't they?" she asked. "They suspect," I said, "but they're not ready to admit it yet. It would hurt too much." The cliffhanger wasn't what I would do next. The cliffhanger was how much longer they could survive the weight of their own assumptions. The power shift had begun, and it was entirely invisible. They were still the winners in their own minds, but they were starting to look like ghosts. I sat down at my desk and opened a file. It was a proposal for a new community project, one that would require the kind of capital and influence that fallen men don't have. I was about to go public with a new venture, but not in the way they expected. The next time they heard my name, it wouldn't be in a whisper. But for now, I enjoyed the quiet. The lie was still out there, doing its work, changing the shape of their world, while mine remained exactly as I had built it. Section 5. When comparison starts to hurt the comparer. The turning of the leaves in the suburbs always brings a sense of reckoning. It is a time for closing accounts and preparing for the winter. For our circle, the reckoning was no longer a metaphor. It was becoming a daily reality. I stayed silent because I realized that the hardest part of a lie is the moment it stops providing comfort. Brian and Jason had used my failure as a shield for a year. Now, as the local economy tightened and their own industries began to stall, that shield was turning into lead. They were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at me with a desperate, hidden resentment. I was at the country club's public lounge, not as a member, but meeting a prospective partner for a new philanthropic foundation I was seeding. I saw Brian at the bar. He looked disheveled. His tie was loosened, and his eyes were bloodshot. He didn't see me at first. He was staring at a glass of scotch as if the answers to his debt were written in the amber liquid. When he finally looked up and caught my eye, he didn't offer a mercy smile. He looked angry. He looked like a man who had been cheated. He walked over, his gait slightly unsteady. "I saw your name on the donor list for the new children's wing, Aaron," he said, his voice a low hiss. "Must be some mistake. Or maybe you're spending the last of your savings on a vanity project. It's a bold move for a man who's supposedly reassessing his life." He was trying to bait me. He needed me to admit I was broke, or he needed me to admit I had lied. Either way, he wanted to reclaim the moral high ground. I realized then that Brian's pain wasn't caused by my success. It was caused by the collapse of his own metric. I stayed silent for a moment, letting the noise of the crowded room fade. "I care about the foundation, Brian. The numbers are less important than the impact." I didn't confirm the donation amount, which was 7 figures. I didn't explain that the last of my savings was actually the interest on a trust he couldn't imagine. I just gave him a simple, quiet truth. He laughed, but the sound was brittle. "Impact! Right! That's what people say when they can't compete in the real world anymore. You're playing at being a saint because you failed at being a player." He was leaning into the narrative he had built, even as it was crumbling around him. He needed me to be the failure so he could still feel like the player. But the comparison was starting to hurt him. Every time he saw me, calm, healthy, unburdened, it highlighted his own high blood pressure existence. I stayed silent because I saw the trap he was in. If I fought back, I would be engaging in his game. I would be validating his belief that status is the only thing that matters. By remaining still, I was forcing him to face the void. He walked away without saying goodbye, leaving a trail of bitterness in the air. I went back to my meeting. My partner, a woman of significant influence, asked who that was. "An old friend," I said. "He's going through a difficult season." I noticed that the group chat had become a graveyard. No more brewery invites, no more boastful photos of new purchases. The silence from my phone was no longer a sign of my exclusion. It was a sign of their exhaustion. They had spent so much energy maintaining a hierarchy that they had nothing left for actual friendship. They were all hiding their own declines from each other, still pretending to the group while they bled out in private. The psychological pressure was shifting. For months, I had been the one under the microscope. Now, they were turning the lens on each other. I heard through Emily that Rachel was questioning Brian's late nights at the office. I heard that Jason was trying to sell his house quietly, listing it as a desire to downsize rather than a necessity. The story they had written for me was now the script they were forced to follow themselves. I stayed silent because the truth was doing its work without my help. A social structure built on comparison cannot survive when everyone is losing. They had used me as the bottom of the ladder for so long that they forgot the ladder itself was leaning against a house of cards. I was the only one who had stepped off the ladder entirely. I was the only one standing on solid ground. The cliffhanger was no longer about when they would find out the truth. It was about what they would do to each other before they did. I could see the cracks forming in the marriages, the partnerships, and the egos. They were turning on one another because they couldn't turn on me anymore. I was too far away. I was too quiet. I was too free. As I drove home that night, I realized that the silence I had maintained wasn't just a choice. It was a weapon of mass destruction for their illusions. I hadn't destroyed their world. I had simply stopped helping them pretend it was real. Section 6. They began explaining themselves to me. The shift happened during the first week of December. It started with a phone call from Jason. Not a mercy text, but a real voice-to-voice call. His tone was different. It lacked the sharp, competitive edge of the last few years. It sounded hollow. "Hey, Aaron," he said. "I was just thinking about that lunch we had. I think I might have been a bit distracted that day. Things have been a bit chaotic with the firm. You know how it is." I realized then that he was beginning to negotiate. He wasn't checking on me. He was trying to justify his own situation to someone he thought would understand failure. I stayed silent, allowing him to fill the gap with his own nervous energy. I mean, downsizing isn't the worst thing, right? We're looking at a place in the city, more urban, you know. Rachel says it's for the lifestyle change. It's not a financial thing, obviously. He was lying to me, and he knew I knew he was lying. But he needed me to agree with him. He needed the fallen man to tell him that falling was okay. I stayed silent because I wouldn't give him that easy out. I wouldn't validate his deception. Lifestyle changes can be very revealing, Jason. You find out what you actually need. I kept my voice neutral, offering no judgment but also no comfort. Then came the emails from Rachel to Sophie. They were long, rambling messages about the stress of the holidays and the unrealistic expectations of their social circle. She was trying to build a bridge back to Sophie, sensing that the Mitchells might be the only ones left with any actual stability. She was planting seeds of an apology she wasn't brave enough to give. She was trying to rewrite history, suggesting that they had always been there for us during our tough year. I stayed silent because I was watching the desperate scramble for a new narrative. They couldn't be the winners anymore, so they were trying to be the survivors. And to be survivors, they needed to be part of my world. They were trying to pull me back into the group, not as a peripheral figure, but as an anchor. They wanted my peace to be a blanket for their chaos. The social pressure was now entirely on them. They were the ones who had to explain the missing cars, the canceled vacations, and the strained smiles. And the most painful part for them was that I didn't ask. I never asked why they were selling the boat. I never asked why Brian was no longer a partner at his firm. My lack of curiosity was the ultimate insult. It showed them that I didn't need their status to define my own. I stayed silent because I wanted them to experience the full weight of their own transparency. When you live for the eyes of others, the moment those eyes stop looking is the moment you cease to exist. I had stopped looking at them as competitors a long time ago. Now, I was stopping looking at them as friends. I was just observing. A week later, Brian called. He didn't lead with a joke or a boast. He sounded like a man who had been hit by a train. "Aaron, I need to talk. Man to man. I think I made some mistakes. With the investments, with the way I handled things. I thought I was ahead, but I was just running in place." He was finally cracking. The pressure of the lie was too much. He was looking for a confessor. I realized then that he chose me because he thought I was the only one who wouldn't judge him, because he thought I had already hit the bottom. He thought we were finally peers in failure. I stayed silent for a long time, listening to him breathe on the other end of the line. The silence was heavy. It was the sound of a decade of pretension evaporating. "Errors in judgment happen to everyone, Brian," I said finally. "The question is, what you do when the audience leaves the room." I didn't tell him I had seen his firm's liquidation filings. I didn't tell him I knew about the second mortgage. I let him believe he was telling me a secret. I let him have that one last shred of dignity. He started to cry. It was a quiet, desperate sound. "I don't know who I am if I'm not the guy with the answers, Aaron. I look at you, and you don't seem to care. How do you not care?" He was asking the real question now. He was asking for the secret to my silence. I stayed silent because the answer wouldn't have helped him. The secret wasn't that I didn't care. It was that I had built my life on something that couldn't be taken away by a market shift or a social snub. I had built it on the truth. And he wasn't ready for the truth yet. He was still trying to find a way to make the lie work. The cliffhanger was no longer about their survival. It was about my revelation. The foundation I had been building in silence was almost ready to be unveiled. The local papers were already starting to ask questions about the anonymous investor who was transforming the downtown corridor. The time for silence was coming to an end. As I hung up the phone, I looked at Sophie. She was sitting by the fireplace, reading a book. She looked up and smiled. "Was that Brian?" she asked. "It was a version of him," I said. The one that finally noticed the silence. I knew that the next time we all met, the story would have to change, not because I would speak, but because the world would speak for me. And when it did, the hierarchy they had spent their lives building would be gone forever. Section 7. Status shifts. Don't make announcements. The transition from being the fallen friend to the silent power happened without a single press release or a dramatic confrontation. It happened in the quiet reality of city records and legal transfers. I had spent the last 18 months acquiring distressed real estate and investing in local infrastructure under a series of holding companies. To the world, and especially to Brian and Jason, I was a man living on the fumes of a failed career. I stayed silent because I knew that the most profound shifts in power are the ones that occur while everyone else is looking the other way. The moment of collision came at the annual City Planning Gala. This was the one event our old circle always attended to see and be seen. Brian and Jason were there, though they looked like ghosts of their former selves. Brian's tuxedo was a decade old, and Jason spent the evening hovering near the open bar, avoiding the gaze of the city's true movers and shakers. They were still clinging to the edges of a world that was rapidly outgrowing them. I saw them huddled in a corner, their eyes scanning the room for anyone who might still believe their story of temporary setbacks. I entered the room with Sophie. We didn't make a grand entrance. We didn't dress to impress. We dressed to belong. I saw Brian's jaw drop as the mayor of the city walked straight past him to greet me by my first name. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. It wasn't just surprise. It was the look of a man who realized he had been playing checkers while the person he was pitying had already bought the board. I stayed silent, offering only a polite nod as the mayor thanked me for the transformative investment in the North District. I realized then that the true horror for Brian and Jason wasn't my success. It was the fact that I had allowed them to believe in my failure for so long. Every mercy coffee, every condescending text, every fake sympathetic dinner party flashed through their minds in a matter of seconds. They realized that my silence wasn't a symptom of my defeat. It was a testament to their irrelevance. I hadn't hidden my life from them because I was ashamed. I had hidden it because their opinions simply didn't factor into my reality anymore. Jason tried to approach us near the end of the night. He looked like he wanted to be angry, but he was too broken for it. "Aaron?" he stammered, his glass shaking slightly. "The mayor? The North District project? That's you? You've been sitting on this the whole time? Why didn't you say anything? We were worried about you." The lie was still there, even in his shock. He was trying to claim the moral high ground of friendship one last time. I stayed silent for a beat, looking at him with a level of clarity that seemed to make him shrink. "You weren't worried about me, Jason. You were worried about yourself. You needed me to be the warning so you could feel like the success. I just didn't want to interrupt your narrative." I said it without malice. I said it as a simple observation of fact. He had nothing to say in return. The social hierarchy he had spent his life navigating had just collapsed under the weight of a truth he was never prepared to handle. I noticed Rachel and Emily watching Sophie from across the room. They didn't come over. They couldn't. The distance between their lifestyle changes and Sophie's quiet, authentic confidence was now an unbridgeable chasm. They had spent years trying to make Sophie feel small for a decline that never happened. Now, as the reality of our position became public knowledge, they were the ones who felt invisible. The psychological pressure in that room was suffocating, but only for them. For me, it was the first time in years I felt like I could breathe. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to watch them squirm. The consequences were unfolding naturally. Their own arrogance was the architect of their humiliation. They had built a prison of assumptions, and now they were the only ones locked inside it. The cliffhanger wasn't whether we would remain friends. That question had been answered long ago. The cliffhanger was what would remain of their own identities now that their benchmark for failure had been revealed as a master of the game. I saw Brian leave the gala early, walking alone into the cold night. He didn't look back. He knew that the story was over, and he was the one who had misread every single page. Section 8. What people feel when their assumptions expire. The aftermath of a social explosion is often quieter than the event itself. In the weeks following the gala, the group chat didn't just go silent, it was deleted. The core crew had officially dissolved. I stayed silent because there was nothing left to be said. The truth had reached a level of explicit clarity that made conversation unnecessary. I was no longer a person to them. I was a mirror that reflected their own insecurities and the fragility of their status-obsessed lives. One final interaction occurred on a Tuesday morning. I was at a small, independent bookstore I had recently helped keep afloat. Brian was there, looking for a book in the personal finance section. He looked older, his hair thinning, his shoulders slumped. He saw me, and for the first time in years, he didn't try to mask his expression. There was no pity, there was no competition. There was only a profound, quiet exhaustion. "You really let us believe it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You let us sit there and talk down to you. You let us think you were nothing. Why, Aaron? Was it some kind of game?" He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for a reason. He needed to know why a man would choose silence over the satisfaction of being right. I stayed silent for a moment, looking at the shelves of books around us, centuries of human thought and ego captured in ink. It wasn't a game, Brian. It was an observation. I wanted to see who was still there when the noise stopped. I wanted to know if the friendship was about the person or the position. I didn't need to tell him that he had failed the test. He already knew. He looked at the floor, the weight of 100 missed opportunities for genuine connection pressing down on him. He nodded slowly. "I think I lost more than just the money," he said. It was the most honest thing I had ever heard him say. He turned and walked out of the store without buying anything. He didn't ask for a loan. He didn't ask for a job. He finally understood that some things, once broken by arrogance and silence, cannot be mended by an apology. I realized that the moral victory I had achieved wasn't about the wealth or the projects. It was about the dignity of restraint. By not correcting their lies, I had allowed them to expose their own characters. I had remained the same man through their pity and through their shock. My life hadn't changed because of their assumptions, only their access to it had. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from their fall, but from my own steadiness. Sophie and I eventually moved further out into the country, into a house we had designed years ago but waited for the right time to build. We kept our circle small. People like Mark Ellison, who had seen the truth without needing it, shouted at him. We lived a life defined by competence and peace, rather than comparison and noise. The suburbs of North Carolina continued their frantic race for status, but we were no longer in the running. I stayed silent because I learned that silence is the ultimate filter. It removes the people who only value the volume of your voice and leaves behind the ones who understand the depth of your character. Brian and Jason became stories I told to myself when I needed to remember the danger of pride. They weren't villains. They were just men who had mistaken the shadow for the object. The final emotion I felt as I looked out over our new land was one of profound clarity. The hierarchy was a ghost. The competition was a lie. The only thing that remained was the work I had done and the person I had become while no one was watching. The story of Aaron Mitchell, the fallen professional, had expired. In its place was a man who didn't need to be understood to be whole. I closed my laptop and walked out into the garden. The sun was setting, casting long, peaceful shadows across the grass. There was no buzz in my pocket, no demands for my time, no need to prove I was winning. I had outlasted the gossip. I had outlasted the betrayal. I had outlasted the lie. And as the world grew dark and still, I realized that the greatest power a man can have is the power to let people be wrong about him and still sleep perfectly at night. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.